Let's talk about the California missions, but we're going to look at them through a lens you might not have seen before, as a story of survival. We're going to go way beyond the familiar narrative and get into a much deeper and honestly a more complex history. You've probably seen pictures like this one before, right? This is a postcard from way back in 1913, and it shows that classic, almost romantic scene, Spanish missionaries, peacefully sharing their faith with Native Americans who seem totally receptive. This is the version of the story many of us were taught. But that simple picture, it hides a much, much tougher reality. It completely leaves out the struggle of Indigenous people who were fighting not just for their own lives, but for the survival of their entire culture. So, to really understand that story of survival, we first have to face the devastating reality that the mission system created for the Native people of California. And honestly, the numbers are just a gut punch. Before the Spanish arrived, historians estimate the native population was somewhere between 300,000 and maybe even 1 million people. But just look at this chart. By the 1830s, after the missions had been operating for decades, that number had plummeted to around 150,000. It was an absolute catastrophe. Let's put that into even sharper focus. If you look at the mission records themselves, by 1833, the Spanish missionaries had baptized roughly 81,500 Native Americans. But here's the number that tells the other side of that story. In that exact same period, over 62,000 of those baptized people were also buried. Think about that. The death rates inside the missions were just staggering. So what was happening? Well, the causes were tragically clear. You had widespread disease just ripping through crowded, unsanitary living quarters. You had starvation, because there often wasn't enough food. And countless reports confirmed severe physical and mental abuse. It was a truly brutal system. And a system this devastating doesn't just happen by accident. It was built on a very specific mindset. The Spanish called themselves gente de razón, which means people of reason. But they called the native people gente sin razón, people without reason. That dehumanizing language created this really clear hierarchy that was used to justify everything, the forced labor, the subjugation, the whole shebang. So that brings us to the most important question of all. When you're faced with that level of oppression, that kind of violence, how do you fight back? How did Native people manage not just to survive, but to make sure their cultures would endure? And this is where we get into the incredible story of Native resistance and survival during this period. Now, it's so important to understand that when we say resistance, it's not just about open warfare or big rebellions. It took so many different forms. Of course, there were rebellions and escapes, but there were also the everyday, often quiet acts of keeping your language, your stories, and your traditions alive. In a situation like this, just surviving is an act of defiance. This quote from an oral history, it gives you such a powerful personal window into one of the most direct forms of resistance, just running. An Ama woman is describing how a family fled, and she says it so plainly. They would have been killed if they had been caught. I mean, can you imagine? This was a life or death gamble for a chance at freedom. But beyond these dramatic escapes, an equally powerful form of resistance was happening every single day. It was this determined, quiet effort to make sure their culture would endure, even inside the mission walls. So check this out as an example of incredible cultural adaptation. The Ama people saw the Christian cross, this really powerful symbol of their colonizers, and what did they do? They brought it into their own sacred shrine. They weren't replacing their beliefs, they were blending, adapting, making sure their own traditions found a way to continue. And this happened in their stories too. In their traditional tales about fighting monsters, the Ama started swapping in sacred olive wood, which was a plant the missions introduced, for their own traditional spiritual plants. By weaving these new elements into ancient stories, they kept those stories alive for the next generation. And women were so often at the very heart of this cultural survival. They were the ones teaching the kids, passing down traditional knowledge, practices, and ways of life, making sure that the next generation never, ever forgot who they really were. Now, this story absolutely does not end when the missions close. In fact, the fight for cultural survival, for recognition, for justice, it's still going on, right now, today. You see, the trauma and the displacement from the mission era, it left a legacy that California's tribal nations are still living with. This isn't just some dusty chapter in a history book. It's a present-day reality that shapes their communities and their ongoing struggles.
And today, there are legal tools to address some of these historical injustices. For example, there's a law called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. This law allows tribes to reclaim the remains of their ancestors and their sacred items from museums and government agencies. It is a long, difficult process, but it's a vital part of healing.
This quote from a tribal descendant is so powerful because it gets right to the heart of the ultimate goal: acknowledgement. It's this plea for recognition, for the land that was taken, the culture that was suppressed, and for their true place in California's history. So, I want to leave you with a final question. When we actually move past those romanticized postcards and confront the full story of the missions, a story of both devastation and incredible resilience, how does that change our view not just of the past, but our understanding of the world we live in right now?